today's World Insight. A keen eye on China-U.S. trade relations as U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen pays China a visit. What's on the agenda? How could the visit help mend strained ties?
Hello, I'm Tian Wei, and welcome to World Insight. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is visiting China from July the 6th to the 9th, just weeks after U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's trip to Beijing. This afternoon, Yellen arrived in Beijing, kicking off the first face-to-face meeting with her Chinese counterpart. In April, she said in her Johns Hopkins speech that a full separation of the Chinese and the U.S. economy would be disastrous for both countries and destabilizing for the rest of the world. Rather, she said the health of the Chinese and the U.S. economy is closely linked. On Monday's meeting with Chinese ambassador to the United States Xie Feng, she did convey the importance of cooperation between the world's two top economies on global challenges. So what could we realistically expect from Secretary Yellen's trip to China? Could the trip help put China and U.S. relations back on somewhat a more positive track? Let's loop in our panelists. In Washington, D.C., Saurabh Gupta, a senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist with Institute of China-American Studies. In New York, Max Wolf, CEO of Systematic Ventures. In Beijing, Rong Ying, Vice President of China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Now, we have been hearing from both sides as the expectations of this visit. Exactly how would you characterize it, as we see you are coming from different walks of life and different countries, both sides? Mr. Gupta, geopolitically speaking, what is the expectation, briefly?
The expectation is that the ties will warm up, that the lines of communication, channels of communication will be deepened, and that this will be a stepping stone for greater understanding between the two sides, and hopefully that there will be more deliverables down the way, particularly with a meeting with President Xi and President Biden, hopefully taking place at San Francisco at the end of the year.
Mr. Rong, geopolitically speaking, from the Chinese side?
Well, I think this is a continued process of the high-level communications and exchanges between the two countries, the two most important economies in the world. And of course, I think if as we follow up the Secretary remarks, and I think we do have reasons to be hopeful that this is a very important visit, and some progress and more progress will be made along this line.
What about economics, trade, financial sector, Mr. Wolf? You are coming from the private sector.
Sure. So look, I think that the private sector has long realized what hopefully all the governments are getting refocused on, which is that there isn't exactly a Chinese economy and an American economy. There's a global economy of which these are twin support pillars. And American prosperity, Chinese prosperity, and indeed global economic prosperity requires the warmest, openest, most friendly relationship possible between the United States and China, and that we have suffered. The Chinese have suffered, the global economy has suffered the sort of turbulence of the last many years. And so the greatest hope is that we are turning the corner toward a more positive momentum and at least stopping the negative momentum we saw kind of begin with the Trump election and continue through the early years of Biden. So that's the hope. I mean, I don't know that that's assured, but I think it's hopeful. Each meeting that both sides announce as successful creates the next meeting at a higher level. That is quite positive, I think. I also think that we got the sort of initial bounce from the COVID recovery. And if we want a sustained economic recovery, we need more sustained cooperation between the U.S. and China.
Mr. Rong, from trade, the financial sector, what is the expectation from the Chinese side?
I think certainly there are many issues on the agenda left over by the previous administration. But I also want to be cautious in the sense that because these issues are very complicated, and these issues have very much touched upon the real nature, the very nature of the difficulties of our relationship, China and the United States.
What are the issues that you're talking about here?
We're talking about the competition, talking about the perceptions, talking about the policy and the strategies of the United States towards China in terms of the rise, in terms of its impact on U.S. Status, primacy in the world, and of course the domestic politics, the dynamic in the changing dynamic in the United States as the election is coming very soon.
Okay.
So we are hopeful, but also with really some cautions.
Now, Mr. Gupta, the U.S. side officials are unknown, the name not revealed, according to media reports, have already suggested very briefly about the goals of the visit, talking about responsibly manage the relationship, about communicate directly about the areas of concern, about how to deal with global issues together. Now, how much do you see these three grand goals can be, in a way, achieved?
Well, I think that it is a third goal which can be fundamentally moved forward. I think there is a congruence of views on both sides with regard to on some of the macroeconomic issues, global macroeconomic issues, be it with regard to enhancing the lending capacity of the multilateral development banks towards, say, climate change, as well as working together in terms of reducing debt distress in some of the poorer countries. On those issues, views are not exactly conjoined, it's not harmonious, but there's space for the two sides to construct bargains.
Right.
So I think that will be the clear area of focus, because I do not expect on the other bilateral trade and economic issues there will be progress. But the U.S. is trying to assure or reassure China that it's trying to de-risk, not decouple the relationship. But I frankly don't think that's going to be believed at Beijing's end.
Everybody is watching right now some of the footages of Secretary Yellen earlier. Of course, we played on the screen, trying to board a plane to Beijing, and also warmly received by a official from the Ministry of Finance from China, together with the U.S. ambassador to China in the Beijing airport. Now, one of the things a lot of people are been using it as anecdote is when she arrived, there was a little rain in Beijing. After the rain, there was rainbow in the sky. Both of the guys who were receiving her at the airport pointed to the rainbow and say, "Did you see?" One could read from the lip. So that was quite interesting. Mr. Rong, the Chinese are always, of course, very interested in how, nature is giving us signs about the future. And Mr. Rong, that certainly sounds like a good, after rainbow's good start.
Indeed, I think, as I said, that this is, of course, we're always hopeful that the relationship would, like the rain or even storms that we have had, and now would embrace or coming with rainbows and clear skies. But as again, I think the problems are there, and we can only hope for. And I think they're just the beginning, and a positive beginning, as our two American panelists that has been alluding. And I only certainly very much hopeful and expecting that this visit will help make it possible, so that we have a clear sky and in a steady and a health way. Okay.
Well, Secretary Yellen, before heading for Beijing, he met with the Chinese ambassador to the United States, Mr. Xie Feng. Actually, Mr. Xie, after the meeting, described the talk as candid and constructive discussion. I'm doing a direct quote. Ambassador Xie also raised China's main concerns in economic and trade areas and asked the U.S. side to take them seriously. That is according to some of the latest readout coming from the Chinese side regarding that meeting. Now, Mr. Rong, given what Ambassador Xie illustrated in the discussion, how do you see China will take the kind of approach toward Secretary Yellen this time?
I think China has been quite positive, constructive, and also I think frank in speaking out its concerns. If we remember, I think long before well before the Biden administration taking over, the Chinese side came up with lists. I think 3 lists as far as I can see, and some of one is about the list of problems. The others is about the list of the issues China feel the two sides can discuss about, and then other issues, a list of where are issues that they may not be able to work out or solve, but they have to recognize these issues are there. So this is a very pragmatic but also constructive way. Unfortunately, I think two-thirds of the time of this administration has passed away and had little progress. But of course, it's never too late to start to look at and work on these lists to address the concerns of China and also of the United States. So the mutual concerns have to be addressed.
Well, Mr. Wolf, many look at Secretary Yellen's track record, very strong professionally speaking. After served in the Federal Reserve, she now is the Treasury Secretary, and she early back in April, as we quoted earlier in our program, had been talking about the total separation of China and the United States going to be disastrous for everyone. So in Chinese eyes, at least from the references I've been reading, she is being regarded as professional, as having a calm mind, as one that would have the reasoning in bringing in different opinions, at least to the extent that she can. But to what extent, in your understanding, is her position among all the top administration officials of the Biden administration? And what about the timing now in terms of much window opportunity she could have if she wants to make the effort?
So I think certainly she is an elder statesperson, right, in the U.S. who has been right quite often, who's been vindicated, who comes from our top universities and has sat in the top and the second slot in the Federal Reserve and served with distinction through many roles for a long time. I think in the Biden administration, she has great gravitas and she will be largely listened to. I think more broadly in the American polity of today, reasonable voices don't do very well. And I think, unfortunately, hers may suffer the same fate so many other more reasonable voices have suffered. That being said, I think because global commodity prices have come down and because international policy has not been the focus of rivalries between the Biden administration and Republican critics, we could have a very positive thing developing here in which U.S.-China relations stop being the focus of these debates. And unfortunately, when they are, things can pretty quickly devolve into sort of ridiculous and sometimes racist, counterproductive arguments. So I think the fact that the attention has shifted elsewhere is good. I think she's an elder statesperson, which is good. And I think that her words have a good reminder value that the U.S. relationship with China is one of mutual benefit or mutual suffering. And so hopefully we can see the mutual benefit as a way to see each other in these bridgeable but significant areas of friction.
How much window opportunity would you say, Mr. Gupta, that she might have and all her Chinese counterparts might have in the discussion?
I would like to put in a word of caution out here. She is very good, and if she had been in the Barack Obama administration, she would have made a terrific Treasury Secretary. But remember, just 1 week after her speech at Johns Hopkins, Mr. Sullivan gave a speech, a very important speech also at Brookings, which was titled A Foreign and Trade Policy for the Middle Class. And it had 5 pillars: modern industrial policy. We've seen that in the CHIPS and Inflation Reduction Act. It's to exclude China. It had cooperation with like-minded partners, essentially a means to isolate China. He talked about moving away from traditional trade agreements to new international partnerships like IPEF, which isolate China. He talked in terms of technology protection, small yard, high fence, again directed at China. The only one pillar which he talked about where there's area of congruence was in terms of repurposing the multilateral development banks and tackling climate change. And frankly, yes, that's an area where there is a lot of cooperation. But if you can understand in the larger context of where the administration is going economically, international economic policy, hers, I'm afraid, is a somewhat minority voice, unfortunately.
Mr. Rong, from China's perspective, how much a window opportunity do the two sides have if they are sincerely interested in having sincere conversation in order to build trust and work on some pragmatic issues at least?
Yeah, I think certainly China is ready, and China would, I think, would be happy to work together with the United States to find the right way, right approach to address the issues that facing the bilateral relation, but in the terms of trade and economic interactions. But I would like to echo to Dr. Gupta's caution in the sense that I think China, while have a huge respect and high regard of Secretary Yellen, China knows very well about the overall strategy or the direction of the Biden administration's policy, including economic and trade policy. So China is hopeful, but it does not have any illusion about the interaction around that. Having said that, again, China made it very clear it is ready and it would do and it will work together with it for the best.
Of course, her trip is also follow up the earlier agreement between the Chinese and the U.S. presidents about establishing more mechanisms for communications between the two sides and trying to work on some of the possibilities of discussions, at least in different areas. Having said that, though, let me go specifically to some of the areas. CFIUS, certainly, Mr. Wolf. Secretary Yellen has a say to a certain extent. So that has been a deadlock issue for China and the United States in terms of trade and its future. How much do you see she, in her capacity, will be able to smooth up somewhat some of the earlier problems and future challenges?
So I think she'll be a voice for reason and for consideration and conversation, which is valuable because we've seen the role of some of the conversations around AI and advanced chip systems and others be very hostile when there's no real purpose to the hostility other than to score political points for being aggressively isolationist vis-a-vis engagement with China. I do think she will end that and be more open in her conversational framework, and direct conversation is certainly better than accusations. But I think she'll have limited public ability to move the discussion. She might have more power behind the scenes to facilitate more reasonable full consideration of whether CFIUS oversight needs to be as aggressive as it has sometimes been, because it's been political. And if we can get it back to looking at the actual business merits, it would be an improvement for both sides.
What about economy? Mr. Wolf, since the U.S. economy is likely to have what some call a mild recession, of course we don't know yet, it's about 1 to 2% GDP growth, some good numbers in terms of jobs. Meanwhile, Chinese economy has been bouncing back, but not necessarily in a vigorous way, but there's still a lot of growth potential. How do you see the economic realities of both sides? Will that create more opportunities or reasons for the two sides not to put too much efforts this time?
So I actually think the economy will be a positive force here in the sense that the U.S. is clearly slowing now. How much it slows, not clear, clearly slowing. I think there's also been a little bit of a taking off of the heat of some of the particular input and raw material price pressures and shortage pressures because of some recent discoveries and the fall in price there. I think that is quite handy. That is useful here. The other big sort of wild card for economic cooperation here is I think that through some pretty interesting policy-making decisions, we've started to see spheres of influence where there's a sort of Chinese trade sphere and American trade sphere developing, the more quickly we can see some softening there, the more the global economies can integrate a little more and both save face. They can do it through the proxy regions that they have influence over. So I think that's what I would look for here. If there's a warming of the greater spheres of economic activity between the two countries, that would be a positive indicator for go forward greater communication and collaboration.
I see. Mr. Gong, I know you are not an economist, but may I ask the question from the other way around? We see both sides have been making gestures of different directions. For example, right before Secretary Blinken's visit to China, the U.S. was putting on more Chinese companies' names into the so-called list and preventing these companies from doing businesses in the U.S. and the other way around too. And meanwhile, we also see later, after the visit to China recently, put some of the rare materials on the list. So how do you see both sides' gestures? How much this is giving more space for maybe political maneuvering, given that it has always been an interesting negotiation going on between the two sides, if they can talk to one another?
That's a great question. I think the one of the issue on the agenda is not, I think as far as I can see, is not, which is also important, is not to address or resolve problems, rather to listen to each other, to talk to each other. I think it would be good for Secretary Yellen to have a good conversations with the Chinese economic team. By the way, it is also new, and to have a better understanding of each other's macroeconomic policies on specific issues related to each other. For example, the issues talking about export controls and also the concerns of the business communities of the two countries, and to see if they can find a way, or ready to find a way to address them for the mutual benefit, for the steady health environment for that. I think Secretary Yellen's speech touched upon that, and also Secretary Blinken's speech, at least I think in his visit, he heard the concerns voiced by the U.S. community in Beijing, in China. So I thought that would be also something even not so exciting, but very much important in terms of mutual understanding and.
Mr. Gupta, what about from your perspective?
I think that's a very, very good point, because, for many months, the two sides weren't even talking to each other. The main issue of initiating communication is, yes, at a structural point, from a structural standpoint, you want to have those open lines of communication. It's good. It stabilizes the relationship. Right. But also thereafter, you need to know exactly the exact policy position on specific issues where there are differences, and that can only happen by listening. Think of something like fentanyl. The U.S. side thinks like, come on, Americans are getting killed out here. China can just turn the tap off, or at least do something like that. But the Chinese side was very clear when they sat down out there. We have class scheduled fentanyl. Y'all haven't. Y'all should do that. Y'all have the problem. Don't tell us to take medicine for your illness. Also, they told very specifically there are enforcement bodies in China which are now sanctioned by the Americans. Those sanctions have to go off. It's once you speak and know exactly the policy positions and know what you need to do, then that helps to resolve problems. Right. What I would one additional point I'd like to mention out here is the relationship is going to be stabilized because of this conversation. But ironically, also you will see some more actions. Those sanctions against, say, on fentanyl traffickers, on export controls, which were kept on pause after the balloon incident, are now again going to be restarted, because I think both sides have the confidence that their communication will be able to cushion the blows of those actions. So when these actions come, I don't think we should throw our hands up and say, oh my God, we are again going back the other way. That's
exactly what I want to ask the three of you, because we have seen people's yearning for some kinds of trust, at least some degree, minimum. But we see both sides were at least in public is suggesting the other side is not providing much source for trust. But I've also been hearing from experts on U.S.-China relations about decency. at least personal decency when looking at each other in the eyes. Not only that, over the negotiation table, but also after the talks, what they are going to do back at home, on the way home, or on the way to each other's countries, back from each other's countries. What are they going to do? What are they going to say? It matters so much to the trust as well. So how do you see, on the one hand, both sides have their very clear stance almost at this point already. On the other hand, the talks should produce at least some kinds of personal decency to the other side. So how do you see this interesting mixture? I have never been experiencing something because it's something very new today. Mr. Wolf, tell me more about your thoughts on the mixture of these two.
Yeah, so I think that it's very important for our internal politics in the U.S. that success in the global economy and success in the relationship with China are seen as the same. Because I think otherwise we have what we've had now for the better part of 5 or 6 years, really, which is people scoring political points by accusing China of all kinds of social ills, some based in fact, some purely fantastical, not based in anything other than there is no voice against that kind of behavior in most of the party discussions, right? So I do think getting international trade off the agenda, strangely, of the average American voter, which appears to be the case, is actually quite positive because it gives the politicians here a chance to fight each other on other things and focus on a solution that works for everybody here. That being said, I think that, ironically, I think, agreeing with my colleagues, a great success of the Biden administration will draw negative attention going into the election cycle. So a moderate success is better than a great success in the public space of the sort of oddities of American politics right now.
We do not know, Mr. Rong, at this point exactly the list of Secretary Yellen's meetings in China when she's visiting this time, but certainly we are expecting quite a number of them to some of the important voices on the economic, trade, and many other areas. So, Mr. Rong, what is your expectation given this rainbow start?
Well, certainly I think we have a good sign that the rainbow gave us some hope. And in a way that, if I can say that the worst, I would not say the worst has passed, but we have the worst, so we can expect that it will become less worse. But the serious note is that I think what China is looking for is not too much. It's something steady, small, step-by-step approach.
Incremental steps.
Incremental steps to address the concerns that has been hurt there long-standing and has been hurt both sides. So that is, I think, something, there are quite a lot. I think there's agreement, at least as far as I can see on that. But if we can do that, something, that would be very much helpful.
Mr. Gupta, I apologize. You only have 15 seconds if you can, sir.
Oh, I think the finance and trade bureaucracies are the ones which are closest tied in the U.S.-China relationship. I think they're going to take the conversation forward and leave the relationship on a better track than before she arrived in Beijing.
Saurabh Gupta, Max Wolf, Rong Ying, thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. All the best to the visit and to the bilateral discussions. That's all the time we have for today. On behalf of my team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.